So I guess I'll just sort of close out the Trump era by talking about sort of the difference between political power and vigilante violence, which of course was a huge theme during the Trump administration. So of course the Trump administration, thankfully ended today. And while he was in office, there was a lot of fear that he was emboldening and enabling a resurgence of white supremacist violence. Now, obviously this is true to a certain extent. I don't think anyone, will ever forget the images of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, where, a white supremacist drove his car into a crowd and killed demonstrator Heather Heyer. And of course, exactly 2 weeks ago, we saw a pro-Trump mob storm the Capitol, and, there were definitely Confederate flags and Nazi imagery in that crowd. And in both cases, Trump really wavered on condemning the violence, or he sort of spoke out of both sides of his mouth, I guess, when he spoke about it, which of course made it seem like he was pandering to the far right, or at least winking in their direction, right? And I think it's fair to say, that his administration has openly flirted with the far right, probably more than any other administration in living memory, particularly through Trump's hardline immigration policies like the Muslim travel ban and, of course, his calls to build the wall. But that said, I think it's also important to consider something that the political scientist Corey Robin has pointed out, which is that in many ways, Trump was a really weak president. Compared to his Republican predecessors, Reagan and the two Bushes. In terms of legislation, Trump wasn't really able to push through all that much. There were his tax cuts and, a handful of executive orders. But on that last note, Biden has already promised to reverse a ton of them. And, Corey Robin's point is really that the damage that Trump was able to inflict was really only made possible by institutions like the Electoral College, the Senate, and the Supreme Court, and wasn't really like the result of his own authoritarian will. So, in addition to that, when we look also at the far right itself, I think, again, as I said, it's really important to distinguish clearly between political power and vigilante violence. So to use, I guess, just a very basic definition, political power is when a group or individual is able to control or exert some kind of influence on statecraft and public policy. And, I think using that definition, we have to be very clear about what white nationalists and like militia members and other far right extremists are capable of and what they're not capable of. So, first of all, white supremacist extremism is actually on the decline compared to prior decades. And I mention this not to discount it, because obviously it's still a very real threat. It's very dangerous. But I think, the fact that white supremacist violence is declining sometimes gets lost a little bit in the churn of the media cycle, right? So if you look at the news headlines, especially during the Trump years, you'll often see things like, hate crimes have gone up, or there's been an increase in hate groups, or, we have all these headlines about the Proud Boys marching or starting street fights or whatever. And again, all of these instances are definitely troubling. And we also know that it's the far right. It's not like ISIS or left-wing groups or whatever that commits the bulk of the extremist violence in the US. But to kind of put this into historical context, in the US, the Ku Klux Klan was like famously at its height in the 1920s, right? So at the time, I think the Klan said their membership was around 1 million people. That's possible, or, maybe they were inflating their numbers. But what we do know is that in 1925, 50,000 Klan members marched in broad daylight in Washington, D.C. Now, today, on the other hand, KKK membership is down to about a few thousand. In my opinion, that's still far too many. But again, it's a huge decrease from the Klan's peak in the early 20th century. And you could say, well, that was 1920, that was 100 years ago. But we don't even really have to go back that far. There were actually way more far-right militia groups in this country in the 1990s than there are now. So in 1996, there were an estimated 858 militia groups that were active in the US. But by 2000, there were only around 200. So again, we see a decline there. And I want to mention that even though militia activity did go up somewhat during Obama's term, Obama's two terms, militias never really regained the numbers that they had in the 90s. And even just looking to the Trump era, under Trump's term, the far right was and is extremely fragmented. Far right groups splintered even more after Charlottesville. If any of you guys remember the Traditionalist Workers' Party, that was one of the prominent neo-Nazi groups at Charlottesville. They've completely disbanded. The so-called alt-right, which of course was led by Richard Spencer, among various others, is basically back behind their computer screens now and out of the streets. And when you think about different far right elements that are still active, like militias, Proud Boys, various neo-Nazi skinheads, and like just your garden variety racists, I think the good news kind of is that they really don't get along with each other. And another way of putting that is they're really just as prone to sectarianism as the left. So I think a lot about something that Michael Brooks used to say, which is that on the left, we should really claim our wins or celebrate our victories where we can. And I don't think that has to mean giving into triumphalism, but it does mean being clear-eyed about the progress that has been made and also really trying to understand the strength and the scope of reactionary movements today without any sensationalism. So, when we look at something like the recent Capitol riots, I think the question to ask is, maybe less, is this a coup? Is this not a coup? Is this fascism? Is this not fascism? But rather to ask whether what happened was a genuine expression of political power or whether it was something else. And since this is the Jacobin Show, I just want to quickly shout out 2 recent Jacobin articles that I think offer a really useful perspective on what happened at the Capitol. So the first is by Raphael Khachaturian and Stephen Mayer, and they point out that pretty much the entire political class and the corporate sector immediately aligned themselves against the Capitol rioters. So this is a very different political situation than, for instance, the rise of German or Italian fascism in the 1930s, where you see very severe splits within the ruling class that allows fascists to seize power. And the other Jacobin article I wanted to quickly mention is by Danny Bessner and Amber Frost, who have been guests on this channel before. And they look specifically at QAnon, the conspiracy theorists, which was a major presence at the Capitol riot. And they make the case that QAnon is really more of a cult rather than a political movement proper, right? So I want to read a quote from their article. They write, Q has neither the direction, means, nor ability to coordinate the networks required to overtake the American state, nor do they seem especially interested in governing. And so I think that both of these articles together are really valuable because neither of them are dismissing far-right violence. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to contextualize it in order to figure out how to defeat it beyond simply sounding the alarm, right? And most crucially, both of these articles argue that simply restoring the, bipartisan neoliberal consensus, which, as we mentioned earlier, seems to be what Biden is eager to get going, that's not really going to do the trick, because this political consensus is, after all, what sort of produces austerity and inequality, which are the very underlying conditions that help give rise to fringe movements in the first place. So I think I want to wrap up there, but I do want to first mention that, of course, there have been moments in history in the US where vigilante violence did transform into some kind of political power. And I think the most famous example of this is the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow era. So during this era, there's, of course, a surge of extrajudicial white supremacist violence in the South, right as the North is starting to abandon the project of Reconstruction. And during this time, the US is also beginning a period of imperial expansion overseas that relies heavily on kind of this notion of white racial superiority. So one of the foremost experts on Reconstruction, of course, is the historian Eric Foner. So I want to play a short clip where he discusses the end of Reconstruction.
What you might say is, under Reconstruction, the political revolution went forward, but the economic revolution did not. But the political revolution was revolutionary enough that it inspired a wave, as I said, of terrorist violence in the South. The Klan and other groups, the White League, the Knights of the White Committee, they were local organizations all over the place. But they were all basically devoted to using violence to restore white supremacy. They used assassination, arson, assault It's a melancholy fact that probably more American citizens were killed by the Klan and such groups in Reconstruction than Osama bin Laden managed to kill. So it was not a small-scale problem. And eventually, these Reconstruction governments, one by one, were overthrown, partly because of violence in the South, but also because of a retreat in the North from this principle of equality. By the 1870s, partly stimulated by a deep economic depression, which began in 1873, Northerners began to lose interest in Reconstruction. Some of them began to say, you know, these Southern whites are right. I don't know if blacks really can be involved in government. These governments seem to be corrupt, something like that. And eventually, in 1877, as part of the settlement of the disputed election of 1876, Republican and Democratic national leaders reached a deal, the compromise or the bargain of 1877, in which fundamentally, this is a quick little explanation of a much more complicated thing. Republicans retained control of the national government, but the entire South was now under the control of the Democratic Party.
So, I think what's significant about this example of the end of Reconstruction is that it really shows that vigilante violence flourishes or has the potential to really change the political landscape when the state retreats from a principle of equality, as Eric Foner eloquently put it. So I think that means at the end of the day, defeating the far right and extremist violence is going to depend on our ability to not just raise consciousness, but to actually change the conditions that allow extremism to take root. And changing those conditions ultimately, of course, is going to depend on us winning some kind of political power. So I think I'll stop there. As I mentioned, we have Jane McAlevey coming on a little later who, can talk more at length about what it means to build political power or what it looks like to get moving on that project. But I will wrap up for now and turn it over to Paul.
Yeah, I really appreciated the historical perspective, and I understand for many people why it is kind of a frustrating answer for us to say, well, I don't know. I mean, the best thing we can do is try to bring about equality and redistribution of wealth and power. And I think the big question for me is like, are we witnessing a warm-up act to a point where this vigilante violence is connected to real power, where they're being used as the shock troops, or, are we not? I mean, I think that's an open question. And of course, a lot of that depends on how, we act.